The air inside the Gilded Lily was always thick with the scent of truffle oil and old money, a sensory cocktail that Raven had learned to ignore after 3 years of double shifts. At 23, wearing the standard issue white shirt, black dress, and the stiff red apron that marked her as part of the scenery, she moved through the dining room with the practiced invisibility of a ghost. To the clientele, she was nothing more than a pair of hands delivering vintage Cabernet and clearing away half-eaten plates of sea bass, but behind her calm, dark eyes lay a mind that was constantly dissecting, analyzing, and cataloging the world around her. It is a peculiar tragedy of modern society that we often mistake a uniform for a lack of capacity, assuming that the person refilling the water glass possesses a mind as empty as the vessel. Yet Raven was the sharpest blade in a drawer full of dull, silver spoons. She was 6 months away from her master's degree in international relations and linguistics, a fact she kept hidden beneath a polite smile and a yes, sir demeanor, driven by the crushing weight of her father's medical bills and the relentless tuition of a prestigious university that barely tolerated students from her zip code. The evening shift had been dragging in a rhythmic monotony until the heavy oak doors swung open, changing the atmospheric pressure of the room instantly. The manager, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson who sweated through his suits within an hour of opening, practically sprinted to the entrance. Walking in was Junho, a man whose reputation arrived 10 minutes before he did. At 31, the Korean business magnate, rumored to be the head of a syndicate that controlled shipping lanes from Busan to the port of Los Angeles, looked less like a criminal and more like a runway model carved out of granite. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Raven's entire education, and his eyes swept the room with a bored, predatory indifference. He was flanked by 3 men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast, but it was Junho who commanded the silence that rippled through the restaurant. He didn't ask for a table. He simply walked toward the best one in the corner, assuming the world would rearrange itself for him. It did. Raven watched from the service station, her grip tightening on a pitcher of ice water. She recognized the look on his face. It was the look of a man who had never been told no, and certainly never expected to be understood by the help. As she approached the table to pour water, she noticed the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers drummed a chaotic rhythm on the white tablecloth, a sign of impatience that most would miss. But to someone who studied human behavior as a survival mechanism, it screamed that tonight was not the night to make a mistake. The tension at table 4 was palpable, a vibrating wire that threatened to snap at the slightest provocation. Raven moved with fluid precision, placing the crystal glasses down without a sound, making herself as unobtrusive as the floral wallpaper. Junho was deep in conversation with a man to his right, a nervous associate with slicked back hair who was sweating almost as much as Mr. Henderson. They were speaking Korean, rapid fire and aggressive, assuming the privacy of their language was an impenetrable shield in this predominantly Western establishment. This is where the arrogance of the elite often becomes their Achilles heel. They assume knowledge is a luxury good, accessible only to those within their tax bracket. Raven, however, had spent 4 years immersed in East Asian dialects, fascinated by the syntax of negotiation and power dynamics. As she topped off Junho's sparkling water, her ear caught a specific phrase the associate used, a subtle linguistic sleight of hand regarding a termination clause in a shipping contract they were discussing. The associate was lying to Junho, assuring him the terms were standard when, in fact, the phrasing he used implied a total forfeiture of assets in the event of a delay. It was a betrayal happening in plain sight, masked by complex legal terminology. Raven paused, her hand hovering just a fraction of a second too long near the glass. It was a microscopic hesitation, but Junho, whose survival depended on noticing the microscopic, snapped his head up. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto hers. He didn't see a student or a linguist. He saw a waitress who was lingering. "Is there a problem?" he asked in English, his voice smooth but laced with a dangerous edge. The table went silent. The associate looked relieved for the distraction. Raven lowered the pitcher, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "No, sir," she said softly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. I noticed your glass was low." Junho narrowed his eyes, sensing something beneath the surface of her deference. He hated being observed. He hated the feeling that this girl in the cheap red apron was analyzing him. He leaned back, crossing his arms, deciding to make an example of her to vent his frustration with the negotiations. "You are listening," he accused, switching back to English to humiliate her before the room. Hovering like a fly, he gestured dismissively at her, a motion that reduced her to a nuisance. "Do you enjoy eavesdropping on conversations you cannot possibly comprehend?" The associate snickered, emboldened by his boss's cruelty. Raven stood her ground, her chin lifting slightly, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes that caught Junho off guard. He saw the intelligence there, and it irritated him. He wanted to crush it. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "Tell me," he sneered, leaning in, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper that carried across the silent dining room. "What could a waitress possibly find interesting in corporate litigation? If you're so smart, then translate it." The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown down with the absolute certainty that it would not be picked up. The restaurant had gone deathly quiet. Diners froze with forks halfway to their mouths, and Mr. Henderson looked as if he were about to have a coronary event by the kitchen doors. For a second, the only sound was the hum of the HVAC system and the thudding of Raven's own heart. But in that silence, something shifted. The fear that usually governed her interactions with men like Junho evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. It was the clarity of someone who realizes that their armor of invisibility has been shattered, so they might as well pick up a sword. Raven set the water pitcher down on the service tray with a deliberate, heavy thud. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her red apron, and looked Junho directly in the eyes. When she opened her mouth, the English disappeared. "The gentleman to your right is not discussing standard litigation," she said in flawless, formal Korean, her pronunciation crisp, carrying the refined accent of a Seoul news anchor rather than a foreigner. The shock on the associate's face was immediate and total. His jaw went slack, and the color drained from his skin. Junho didn't move, but his eyes widened, the pupils dilating as he processed the impossible sound coming from the waitress. Raven didn't stop there. She continued, still in Korean, gesturing slightly to the documents spread on the table. He used the term asset forfeiture under the guise of a compliance hold. If you sign that addendum in its current state, you aren't just agreeing to a delay. You are legally agreeing to surrender the cargo to the holding company if the timeline shifts by even 6 hours. He is selling you out to the Port Authority's private contractors. She finished the sentence and switched back to English, her voice dropping to a professional, almost bored tone. "Sir," the silence that followed was heavier than the one before. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of a paradigm shift. The associate began to stammer, terrified, looking for an exit that didn't exist. Junho slowly turned his head from Raven to the man beside him. The look on the associate's face confirmed the accusation far more effectively than any confession could have. The man was pale, a sheen of cold sweat breaking across his forehead as he realized the safety of his linguistic fortress had just been breached by the person refilling his water glass. Junho didn't yell. He didn't flip the table or cause a scene that would alert the other diners. Instead, a terrifying calm settled over him, a stillness that was infinitely more dangerous than rage. He picked up the contract, his eyes scanning the paragraph Raven had indicated, and though he wasn't a legal scholar, the context clues provided by the associate's terror filled in the gaps. He looked at the man, then pointed a single, manicured finger toward the exit. The gesture was absolute. There was no negotiation, no severance package, no second chance. The associate scrambled out of the booth, gathering his briefcase with trembling hands, stumbling over his own feet in a desperate bid to escape the gravity of Junho's presence before the consequences became physical. The restaurant remained oblivious to the execution that had just taken place, save for Mr. Henderson, who was watching from the maitre d', stand with his mouth slightly agape, looking as though he were witnessing a natural disaster in slow motion. Junho waited until the doors swung shut behind the trader before turning his attention back to the woman standing beside his table. The dynamic had shifted tectonically. Raven wasn't holding the pitcher anymore. She had set it down, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. She wasn't trembling. Junho studied her, really seeing her for the first time, not as furniture, but as a player on the board. He gestured to the empty seat opposite him, the leather still warm from the man he had just exiled. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive. Mr. Henderson started to rush forward, his hands waving in a panic to enforce the strict hierarchy of service staff, but Junho didn't even look at him. He simply held up a hand, palm out, freezing the manager in his tracks. Raven hesitated for a fraction of a second, the training of 3 years warring with the opportunity of a lifetime, before she untied her apron, folded it neatly over the back of the chair, and sat down. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of class barriers being dismantled in real time. Junho poured sparkling water into the glass that had belonged to his associate and slid it across the white tablecloth toward her. It was a symbolic gesture, an equalization of status that felt louder than a shout. "You speak the Gyeongsang dialect," Junho observed, his voice low, stripping away the arrogance to reveal a sharp, analytical curiosity. "That is not something one learns in a university classroom. That is the accent of the shipyards, of the old neighborhoods in Busan." "How?" Raven took a sip of the water, the bubbles sharp against her tongue, buying herself a moment to calibrate her answer. She knew that men like Junho didn't appreciate embellishment. They traded in information as currency. "My father was a foreman on the docks in Oakland," she replied, her voice steady, locking eyes with him. "He worked with the import crews for 20 years before his back gave out. The crews were mostly Korean. I grew up listening to them argue, bargain, and tell stories during lunch breaks. I learned the language before I learned the grammar." She paused, letting the reality of her background sink in, the blue-collar roots that mirrored his own likely rise to power. "I polished it with a degree, but the ear came from the docks." Junho leaned back, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his stoic features. He appreciated the grit of it. It made sense why she understood the aggressive nuance of the contract. She hadn't learned Korean to read poetry. She had learned it to survive in a world of hard labor and hard negotiations. "And yet," Junho said, gesturing to the busy restaurant floor, to the life of servitude she had just stepped out of, "you are here, carrying plates for people who tip you in loose change. Why?" It was the question that haunted Raven every night, the gap between her potential and her reality. "Because intellect doesn't pay for chemotherapy," she said bluntly, the raw honesty of it cutting through the sophisticated atmosphere. "My father's insurance capped out 6 months ago. The tuition for my master's program drained the savings. I work double shifts here because it's the only place that offers cash tips immediately, and right now, cash is the only thing keeping the lights on." Junho absorbed this information, his fingers steepled under his chin. He was a man who understood leverage, and he saw a tremendous amount of it sitting across from him. He saw a weapon that had been left to rust in a scabbard of poverty. He reached into his inner suit jacket pocket and pulled out a slim, black tablet, unlocking it with a thumbprint before sliding it across the table to her. The screen displayed a complex logistics grid, a digital map of shipping routes, tariffs, and legal hold notices. It was a mess of red flags and warning icons. "I have a conference call in 15 minutes with a supplier in Incheon who believes he has me in a corner," Junho said, his tone shifting from inquisitive to professional. "He is using a dialect even more obscure than your associates, and he is hiding behind bureaucratic delays to drive up the price of raw materials by 40%. My previous translator was too polite to call him a liar. My associate," he glanced at the empty door, was apparently helping him. He looked at Raven, his eyes hard and challenging. I don't need a translator, Raven. I have apps for that. I need a shark. I need someone who understands that a contract is just a declaration of war by other means. He tapped the table next to the tablet. Read the correspondence. Tell me where he is weak. If you can find the leverage, I need to crush this price hike. I will pay off your father's medical debt tonight. If you fail, you go back to the kitchen, and I forget you exist. The stakes were absurdly high, a life-changing gamble thrown onto a dinner table, but Raven didn't blink. She pulled the tablet closer, her eyes scanning the data streams, the emails, the aggressive posturing of the supplier. The world around her, the clinking silverware, the murmur of conversation, the nervous hovering of Mr. Henderson, faded into a dull background hum. Her mind sharpened, shifting into the high-gear analytical mode that she usually had to suppress. She wasn't reading words. She was reading intent. She scrolled through weeks of communication, spotting patterns, delays that didn't match weather reports, and excuses that contradicted Port Authority logs she remembered reading for a grad school case study. 5 minutes passed in silence. Jun-ho watched her, sipping his wine, noting the way her eyes darted across the screen, the way her brow furrowed not in confusion, but in calculation. Finally, she stopped scrolling. She looked up, and for the first time, there was a small, dangerous smile on her face, a mirror of the expression Jun-ho often wore when he knew he had won. He's bluffing, Raven said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She turned the tablet around, pointing to a series of timestamps. He claims the delay is due to a labor strike in the Incheon sector, which justifies the force majeure clause to hike the price. But look here, she tapped a shipping manifest from a subsidiary company. He shipped 3 tons of electronics out of the same port on the same day using the same union labor. There is no strike. He's creating an artificial bottleneck to squeeze you because he thinks you're desperate for the steel. She looked up at Jun-ho, her eyes blazing with a thrill of the hunt. But here's the kill shot. In his last email, he mentioned a compliance review with the Ministry of Trade. If you flag this inconsistency to the ministry, the fact that he's claiming a strike for one client while shipping for another, he doesn't just lose the price hike. He loses his export license for fraud. Jun-ho stared at the data, then at Raven. He began to laugh, a low, rich sound that seemed to startle the nearby tables. It wasn't a laugh of humor. It was the laugh of a man who had just found a diamond in a pile of coal. He checked his watch. The call is in 3 minutes, he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He didn't ask if she was coming, he simply expected it. Mr. Henderson, he called out, his voice booming. The manager scurried over, looking terrified. She is finished for the evening. In fact, she is finished forever. Send her final check to my office. He looked at Raven, extending a hand, not to shake, but to guide her toward the exit, toward the black SUV waiting at the curb, toward a future that had just radically expanded. Come, he said. We have a supplier to bankrupt. The drive to Jun-ho's private offices was a blur of city lights and adrenaline, but Raven felt a strange sense of calm. For years, she had felt like a racehorse forced to pull a plow, her capacity for speed and strategy wasted on the repetitive drudgery of survival. Now, sitting in the leather interior of the SUV, reviewing the strategy for the call, she felt the exhilarating snap of potential locking into place. The call itself was brutal and short. With Raven on the speakerphone, guiding Jun-ho's rebuttals, dissecting the supplier's lies with surgical precision in his own dialect, the opposition crumbled. The supplier stuttered, backtracked, and finally capitulated, agreeing to the original price with a discount for the misunderstanding. When the line went dead, the silence in the office was different than it had been in the restaurant. It was the silence of partnership. Jun-ho opened a drawer in his mahogany desk and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a figure that made Raven's breath hitch. It was enough to cover the hospital bills, the student loans, and leave a cushion she hadn't dared to dream of. He slid it across the desk. This is for tonight, he said. The contract for your employment as my chief strategy officer will be on your desk tomorrow morning. The salary will be commensurate with your value, which, as we have established, is significant. Raven picked up the check, her fingers brushing the paper that represented her father's life and her own freedom. She looked at Junho, the man who had walked in as a villain and was now, in a twisted, pragmatic way, the catalyst for her liberation. You didn't hire me because I'm smart, she said, a realization dawning on her. You hired me because I was hungry. Junho stood up, walking to the window to look out at the city skyline, a kingdom that they would now navigate together. Smart people are everywhere, Raven, he said, his reflection catching hers in the glass. Universities churn them out by the thousands. But people who can translate desperation into power, those are rare. You didn't just translate a language tonight. You translated your worth into a currency I understand. He turned back to her, a challenge still lingering in his eyes. Now go home. Sleep. Tomorrow, we have a lot of work to do. Raven walked out of the building, the cool night air hitting her face. No longer a waitress, no longer invisible, stepping into a world she had finally forced to understand her.